Why the accents? Like every time I start an episode, I know why. Because I don't know how to do it, and it's a sign of my discomfort. It's like the way people use humor to deflect. I
Okay.
use accents, so you'll always know when I'm uncomfortable because I will put on an accent.
Well, settle down, Steph. This is familiar territory now. We're on episode 120 odd. You think it would get easier, and it probably has marginally, but
it has marginally. And I do have the self-awareness to recognize it in myself. So, I mean, what are we talking about today?
funny that you are so self-aware because we are talking about self-deception, which may mean that you don't relate to this topic at all, considering how self-aware you are.
I don't. Can you do this one? Can you talk about it? No, I feel like that's so smug of me.
Also, for the listener, Steph said before we started recording, she said, okay, we can talk about self-deception, but I'm worried I'm going to alienate everybody. So I'm really intrigued to hear Steph's thoughts on self-deception because I can't imagine there's anything you'd say, Steph, that would alienate us from you. But
you just invited me to.
Yeah, I know.
I'm going to just, in the name of radical honesty, I have a really judgmental relationship with self-deception. Like, you know how I talk about how when I binged, I was always very aware, like very present. I think it's part of my vigilance. I hate the idea of me not being aware of something about myself. To me, that's really threatening and unbearable. So I take good care to make sure that I am always like when my husband and I argue about something, he can't. Have I mentioned this before? He gets so mad because he's the type that he'll be like, if I'm like, Mike, you're blah 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 blah, and his reaction is to be like, well, yeah, well, you're blah 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 blah, something totally different. And I'm like, I know, but that's not what we're talking about. Like, I'm talking about how you're blah 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 blah, like so. And he's like, you own it, so it's so infuriating because I know, and I will absolutely admit the things about me that are annoying, like this. I will say that and fully be like, yeah, I know. But that's because there's some kind of I just am not comfortable with not knowing. So it's value to me.
Do you think you have any blind spots about
I'm
you
sure
that the rest of us can see and you can't?
I'm sure that I do. But if you tell me what they are, I will be like, oh, I can see that. Don't test me though.
How did you know my mind was running through all the different things I could say?
I'll be upset about it. And I'll feel attacked and all that, but I'll know that too. And I'll be like, it's me. I got to work through this. You can try it. Go ahead.
I genuinely can't think of anything particular. I was just teasing you. But I liked the fact that you were self-aware enough to say, yeah, there absolutely is likely things that people can see that I can't. You know this from when we've done the values in our workshops. But one of my big ones is self-awareness, which is the opposite to what we're talking about today, self-deception. Although obviously we're going to talk about both because they're interconnected as opposites. And for me, I really thought that when I started training to be a therapist and I was going to go into therapy, I thought the task was to uncover every single blind spot that I had, and I would come out knowing everything about myself. And I find I am not often, it comes up for me. It certainly comes up for me that I have this fear. I've said this before to you, probably on the podcast as well, that I am in some ways self-delusional. Other people can see it and I can't.
Yeah.
That's a really strong fear for me. So I really value self-awareness in other people. People can be extremely flawed and even be behaving in problematic ways. And if their levels of self-awareness is high and they care about what they're doing as well, then I can have quite a lot of empathy and compassion for them in that situation. And I'm so aware, and this came up in the last episode, which is why I suggested that we did an episode on self-deception, of the Groundhog Day, of the binge, of constantly saying to myself, it's okay, I can have this now because tomorrow I'm going to XYZ. And really believing it in the moment, and afterwards knowing that that wasn't even true. Not saying that the self-awareness, as mentioned last week, would have been enough to have halted the binge, But I remember that shift that happened for me once where I started saying to myself, when that thought came into my head, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So I'm just going to go and binge now because tomorrow I'm going to do this. I would say to myself, well, what makes you think you'll be able to do tomorrow what you're struggling to do today? And that question would stop me in my tracks because there's nothing I could say to answer that. And I do think that I'd gone through periods of my binging where it hasn't been restriction based, hasn't been emotion based in as much, yes, I was living in chronic shame. But apart from that part, there was a habitual element to it. It's like, oh, it's 7 p.m. Oh, now I want to go and binge. Oh, no, but this feeling's so strong. That's okay. Just one last time.
Yeah.
That one last time thinking was part of what kept me stuck. It wasn't just getting rid of that thinking that changed everything. Something had to shift deeper and more fundamental. But until I acknowledged to myself that the things I said about what I was going to do later, I couldn't say that for sure now. That was, I think, a step in the direction of self-awareness that then enabled me to get better at self-management, for want of a better word.
How quickly did that shift things? So the awareness coming in, you say that the question itself kind of stopped you in your tracks. Then what?
It was one of those things that sometimes it was helpful and sometimes it wasn't. So the question would come and sometimes it would stop me in my tracks and I would go, oh yeah, this isn't true. I can't say this isn't going to happen tomorrow. I've only got now to make a choice. And sometimes that would be enough to diminish the binge urge. And sometimes I don't care.
Okay.
That definitely kept. Sometimes I was like, yes, I don't care. Right now, I do not care. And I think it's the difference of where those urges were being triggered from. When they were being triggered habitually with less emotional charge behind it, for want of a better, it's not quite the right phrasing, then this question was helpful. But when it was really about numbing, escaping, the self-abandonment stuff we spoke about a few weeks ago, when it was about that, this didn't help because I didn't care about tomorrow.
I don't think I ever had, I'm not relating. I don't think I ever had a time where that thought would have occurred to me that my response wouldn't have been, I don't care. I don't think there was ever, and I think maybe that speaks to my level of self-abandonment because well, first of all, my binges were a lot in the later part physiologically driven from restriction. But even when they weren't, the question of like, why would tomorrow be different? I'd be like, oh, well, I don't like myself anyway. So tomorrow me will deal with that. Good luck to her. I don't think it would have made an ounce of difference to me because I just would have been like, whatever. You know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh, I'm really being mean to myself. But I'm like, yeah, of course I am. I don't care.
So have you had the experience then of any point in your life repeatedly promising yourself you're going to do something, believing you're going to do it, but then you never do?
Yeah, that's easier. In fact, as you were talking, I was like, can I relate this to my making my bed example? And this is so trite, but it's the first thing that came to my mind. So I was a bed maker my whole life. Like I made my bed every day. I really enjoyed it. That sound that came out funny. I didn't enjoy the making of it, but I enjoyed that I made my bed every day and I liked it when it was done, right? And then when we moved into this house, like I stopped making my bed because I didn't have the pillows. This is a bit of perfectionism, I suppose. I didn't have the pillows I wanted on it. And so I've recently gotten the pillows. And for the first like few weeks that I bought them, that I had them, I was like, I'm in the habit now of not making the bed. So I would be like, all right, I'll do tomorrow. And I recently was like, yeah, no, partially driven by, you say that every day. And secondly, driven by the fact of like, I've actually been thinking about the process value of something. Like instead of thinking about it, like, I don't care if the bed's not made, it's really not big of a deal to me anymore. I've lived through the fear and seen the other side, but there's some value in doing something. And I've been talking to a client about that. So actually that's what drove me. I was like, do the process thing, do it for the sake of doing it and for the value of that itself. So I was like, okay. And then I slowed myself down enough to rework that and to have that awareness come in and to change, to literally backtrack my steps and be like, go make the bed. Don't walk out of the room. So yeah, I guess like that level of self-awareness has changed that small process. I'm sure that that's indicative of other ones.
Yeah, there's a phase that you will go through where you're telling yourself, tomorrow I'll do this, even though that's not turning out to be true, but you're believing it each day. And at some point, the self-awareness kicked in for you to use it as an example, right?
Yeah, except I don't know that I really believed that tomorrow. I don't think I really was like, I think there's part of me was like, yeah, I probably won't tomorrow too.
That's
I just
kind
won't.
of
I
the
was just kicking it
self-deception,
down the
though.
curb.
That is
No,
kind of the
don't think
self-deception.
that I
It's
was,
like
I don't think I was telling myself I would. I think I was kind of like, I knew I wouldn't. I knew that wasn't the thing to change. I knew that like it would be, I don't know. I don't think I ever really, I think you should talk more.
But that's kind of the self-deception, is there's two parts of you. Part of you kind of knows it's not really true, and part of you saying it anyway just to feel better in the moment.
No, I don't think that I really, I don't think that I really said it. I think that I'm kind of like, whatever. It's just like, whatever. It's not that important to me. I don't think that there's anything really important to me that I pretend I'm going to do later that I don't. I really don't. I think this is about my anxiety and there's some kind of vigilance about knowing myself that I don't do that. I can't think of something. I'll think about it, but I don't think there's something that I really kid myself about because I'm too willing to be like, I'm probably not going to do that.
I want to say that's where I feel like I am, but I don't know. Is that self-deception? I don't know. This is why I'm really reluctant to make sort of absolute statements about any of this stuff in case in case I sound like I am deceiving myself.
Well, let's talk about where self-deception might show up for people. Besides, well, let's talk in the context of body image.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that.
Oh, go on.
So it's not, again, not now, but I think I did. Yeah, because I was desperate too. So I would believe. Oh, okay. Okay. So in high school, I was, I'd restricted and I was small and I had won my body, right? And then I started binging and I started gaining weight. And during that period of time was a huge, and when I went into college, so I remember I went to Abercrombie and Fitch the summer before I went into college. And I remember buying my fall clothes and I pictured myself at the football games wearing, in the crisp weather, wearing, and I remember one was red and one was blue. They were the same shirt, but in different colors, like these plaid button downs. This was 1997. And I was like, I know that I can't stop eating now, but when I get to college, my environment will be so controlled that I won't be able to binge anymore and I will stop. And then I'm going to lose. So I remember that summer, I like almost used that as this like excuse to finish binging that summer, like my last hurrah, because once I got to college, I really believed that I would stop. And also I believed even more than an environmental level that I would just snap to it. Like I would finally realize that I couldn't keep binging and gaining weight anymore. And I would, just wouldn't anymore because of that, like some kind of logic. And that is why I completely self-destructed in college. Like that is part of why, because the reality of that having been false and realizing like this slow realization that like you were kidding yourself, that was like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, but I in my head, I was just like, you are such an idiot for ever thinking that you were going to like wear those shirts. Those shirts never fit me. And I held on to them for years. I don't think I threw them out until after college because I always imagined that that would happen. I think that was the one delusion that I couldn't bear to think otherwise.
One of the ways I would feel it, how I at the time it certainly felt like self-deception. It kind of was, but the outcome was probably for my higher good, if this makes sense. I remember a few times going paleo or Atkins diet, whatever it might have been at the time, thinking like, okay, I'm just going to eat like this. And then I'd have cravings, right? I'd have cravings for carbohydrates. And I would think, oh, I remember when I did the Atkins, I did it once, like for 3 days or something. I really wanted an apple. I was really craving an apple. And the more this sort of niggled away at me. And then the rationalization comes in. It goes, well, it's just an apple. An apple is like, why would you not allow yourself to have an apple? Apples are good for you. Apples are this, that, and the other. Whatever the justification that comes in with the mind does. And so I'd have the apple. Then I'd have the apple, and then the brain could justify the next thing and the next thing before I know, like, I'd binged on a load of ice cream or whatever it might be. Now, there's obviously the self-awareness part would have been, this is not working for me. I need to eat carbohydrates.
Okay.
But it was almost like this way of, and I say self-deception because I don't think it's always a bad thing. Like, it can be a very protective mechanism as well. There's a reason why we might be in denial about something. Because I, in that moment, couldn't go from trying to follow this straight into eating some of these other things that I wanted to. So I had to kind of go through these gateways in order to get there by convincing myself. But whenever I look back, I always, in hindsight, I thought I knew when I wanted that apple and I decided to have it, where it was going to end up. Part of me knew. But part of me was able to convince myself that wouldn't happen so that I could do it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I've been in that almost exact scenario with, especially with Atkins and keto and stuff, wanting the carbohydrate. Now, there's no part of me that would I would never have convinced myself that there was some rational reason to have it. It would have always been, you can't have an apple because it has carbohydrates. That's not how this works. So I would have known that fully, but been like, well, I'm going to have it. And that would have just been, I would have just cut to the chase. Like, I just been like, I'm going to binge now. And I'm just I wouldn't have gone through the rings of like trying to pretend. But what you said was that the ultimate self-awareness would have actually been to understand that this isn't working for you.
Yes.
That is what I didn't have. Like, oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, like, and I did. I don't kid myself in the details, but the larger thing, I think that like those big conceptualizations of myself and what I'm doing, that's a perfect example of self-deception, that somehow this was working or that I could make it work. That's a good point.
I think it's important as well to draw a distinction between when we may genuinely believe something that turns out not to be true, and the self-deception part is kind of when there's a knowing in you that this isn't actually true. And it's this sort of layering, this convincing of yourself. So when you talked about going to college and what you were telling yourself, when you got to college and nothing had changed, like that part that was like, oh, I knew that this was what was going to happen and I've been kidding myself all along. Whereas for me, I moved quite a few times, and each time I moved, I truly believed it would be different. I truly believed it would be different. I don't think there was any part of me that was just saying, oh, that there was any self-deception in that. It was like a misunderstanding, a misbelief. Like I was believing the thing that just didn't turn out to be true. But with you, with the college thing, when I say it like that, was it self-deception? Or were you retelling it? Was it a case of, how could I dare to hope that it could have been different? I'm an idiot for hoping. Doesn't mean actually I was convincing myself of something that deep down I knew.
No, I really did believe that.
Yeah. So we're back to, you don't deceive yourself.
I just can't find
it. That is the self-deception, is the belief that you don't self-deceive. I don't know. We can't find it. We can't find it. Can't make it fit.
I have a client who has been talking recently about this phenomenon she has where it's interesting. She sometimes will still put vegetables and protein on her plate and not the rice, or whatever, the carbohydrate part, because there's some kind of, and she spoke about it like this. She said, I feel like I'm kidding myself by telling myself I'm still doing the good thing. But what happens is that, because she went out to lunch with a friend, it was a buffet style lunch. She went out, piled her plate high with vegetables and protein, came back to the table, and her friend, who does not have disordered eating, had rice, vegetables, and protein on her plate. She had it all, but her plate, she said, was much more like normal person, right? She said hers was like piled high with all this other stuff. And we talked about the role of satisfaction, and there's a lot of different ways of talking about this. But she said at the end of it, she's like, I think I'm still deceiving myself that I'm doing the good thing. And it's not. She said, I'm not looking myself in the eye. I'm not recognizing that what I'm doing is still disordered. And I think I'm actually eating more than I would be if I just ate like my friend. You know what I mean? Like there's still some kind of goodness, that this self-deception that I'm being good, when it's that none of this is good. None of this is what I want. None of this is even calorically like what I want. Never mind, from a recovery perspective. And she's like, but I keep doing it. I keep doing that. And so we're working on literally awareness of naming this but I think that your point of it isn't that it's protective. There's a reason why we do that. And I think sometimes, the in here is when that mechanism by which we are deceiving ourselves has to do with an old belief or an old need that kept us safe that we're just repeating on autopilot now. You know what I mean? And that there is some level of awareness we can introduce around like, does this make sense anymore? Like, is this thing that I used to do that I used to really need to do to stay afloat in my life and to survive, does this make sense today? And I think that there is sometimes that there's this push, like to my client's point, where all of a sudden she had this moment of coming to the table and seeing the plates, and in that moment she was like, what am I doing? Like I saw it then, you know. I think that sometimes that's how it gets presented to us in the here and now, is like we have this all of a sudden this clarity in a moment. Usually it's in an interaction or an experience where you start to see something with your present day eyes, and then you're like, oh. And in that conflict, I think that that's where there's room for being like, is this old thing deceiving me now? You know what I mean? And there's room to grow there.
That's making me think of splitting and different parts. So it could be one part believes one thing and another part has other views. Someone might say to me, oh, I don't want to be eating all these other foods. It's not that I think I should cut out sugar. I just know I feel better when I don't. I don't actually want to eat these foods. But then they're binging on these foods. And so the part that's saying, I don't want to eat these foods, it absolutely is saying that that's how they feel. That's that part that judges, that's fearful of it, that believes it's always going to be out of control around those foods. Yet there's a part that then binges on these foods. When you talk about that moment, that present day moment, I might think of that as like the executor that can wake up and suddenly go, oh, look at these different parts. So I think quite often the self-deception, it can sound like it's this very like it's this wrong thing to do, and it can just be a splitting of different parts. One part believes one thing, another part believes another thing, and we're trying to cling on to the belief that feels safest. Right. To think I actually don't want to eat these foods,
yes,
than to think, oh my goodness, I there's a part of me that does want these foods for some reason.
yes. That also reminds me of when people talk about their bodies, like where they don't look in mirrors or they don't look at photographs of themselves. And there can even be an awareness of the self-deception where I've had people say to me, I know that I have put on weight and that I'm X size. I know that in my mind, but I can't look at the picture because if I look at the picture or look in the mirror, I'll see it. Mm-hmm. And it's like they know, they're like, I know the thing, but if I look, I'll have to know it. Yes. And I don't want to. So I'm going to just keep not looking in the mirror. Like it's this willingness to self-deceive. And I think that's a bit different. That's different than what we're talking about. But I think where that exists, there's still a present day need for that safety, right? So self-awareness, I think, is different if we don't need it anymore. Then I think there's like something we can work with versus the kind where you're like, I know something, but I don't want to know it still. Mm-hmm. It's going to be too threatening even now.
Yes.
So what does one do? How do we help people?
I don't know, Steph. I have no idea. I like parts work. I like thinking of it as parts. As well, part of me feels like this and thinks like this. Part of me has this belief system over here. If we can welcome both parts, we can bring them in, they'll settle down. If we can listen to both sides, listen to the part that is losing control and wanting to eat all the foods. What's going on for that part? So often, I mean, it comes back to the same things, doesn't it? About restriction and safety and desire for autonomy and so many other factors that can be at play. But we just somehow think that we should just be able to decide how we are, how things are, how we want to think, how we want to be, and then just be it. And I think there's something humbling, the acknowledgement that we have different parts of us with different ideas, and that somehow we've got to manage this classroom.
I like that expression. I think from a practical point of view, first of all, I think awareness work is the longest part of a process. So to not be under an assumption that just because you identify something you want to change, that should happen quickly. I think there is a long time to sit in and as a homework assignment, very frequently, it's kind of like the only thing to do this week or this month is name when this is happening. Name the moment that you're running from the truth. When you're running, like when you recognize that there's some kind of, I think I'm deceiving myself here. Like when you hear the niggle of it, I think the instinct is to be like, no, never mind. To be like, oh, what is it like to not be afraid of that? To just turn around and look right at it and say, oh yes, I think I might be doing. You're not obligated to look in the mirror. You're not obligated to change the behavior, to eat the rice, to whatever. Just simply to start to name it and be less afraid of it. That's hard enough. And that's its own job. So on a practical point of view, what we can do about this in the here and now is to start noticing the moments where we might be self-deceiving, or we think we have a suspicion that might be going on, and to simply call it out, because the fear is driving it. That's why the self-deception remains, because we're afraid to look at what is, or what a part of us is. So just saying, I see you, diminishes some of the block, of what's preventing the awareness in the first place.
And I want to acknowledge that urge to deny parts of ourselves that we don't like or deem to be unacceptable is probably quite an understandable method to try to use. I think it's based, though, on a misconception that if we can just deny and reject these parts, they'll just quietly go away.
Right.
And the truth will be what we want the truth to be. I think there's also a fear that by acknowledging these parts and coming out of denial, that somehow will make these parts stronger and they'll take over. Yeah. If I admit to myself that actually I really enjoy some of these foods and I do want to be able to, or part of me wants to be able to eat these foods and feel freer and have more choice around food, that part's suddenly going to take over. And the paradox is that often the opposite's true. The things that you push outside of your awareness are the things that affect your behavior in ways that you don't understand. Yeah. When we behave in ways that we don't understand, it's because it's something outside of our conscious awareness that is influencing that. So by bringing it forward, it sounds scary and it can be initially scary, but I just want to say to people, it's really worth it. It really is.
I think that's kind of all we need to say. Like that's the end of the episode to me. What you said, I'm going to use in the misconception that by naming it and seeing it, that it will get bigger and take over, and actually it's the opposite is true. Is, to me, that's the bottom line. I think that's so true. Not just around, food and body image, but even the parts of ourselves of our character that we don't like. Like I'm gluttonous, or I'm selfish, or I'm, whatever we don't like about ourselves, as if even like, for me, it's been shyness and stuff, like introversion. I talk about this a lot, but I think for a long time I was like, I'm going to become an extrovert, a friendly, likable extrovert. And so as long as I keep minimizing my introvert, eventually I'll work on this other thing I'm working on. And then she can take over and an extra introvert could just go away. This is not happening. And it's like in naming that I'm an I feel like my life has changed in naming and accepting, like, this is who I am. And I can work with that. Actually, I think I've become more extroverted. Like, I feel like I've become more, because you own it, because there's something about, there's just such freedom in that. And it's like crossing the threshold into awareness is the hardest part. Like, it hurts as you go in. And then once you're there, you're like, why didn't I get here sooner? This is so much easier.
When you were saying about becoming this other thing, it just made me think about how, obviously I've been moving around for quite a few months, and this week has been probably one of the trickiest week where I felt more unanchored by the moving around. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be moving into my own apartment for a while. And I was really fantasizing this morning about what that was going to be like. And I was going like, oh, I'm going to get this great routine in, and I'm going to add this into my routine and this into my routine. I'm going to get so much done. I'm going to be incredibly productive. And I caught myself for a moment. I was like, hang on a second. This is quite different to where you are now, where you're taking yourself to be. There's an element of truth in it. I will get a routine back. And I've always been someone who's liked a routine. So I know I will build up some routines that help. But I think in my mind, I'm taking it. I just saw it. I caught myself doing it earlier, and I was like, and I felt a flash of disappointment when I realized what I was doing. I was like, oh,
you're
no,
fantasizing.
it might not be all what I'm saying it's going to be. Because there's also an element of how I will feel. I will feel so motivated and energized when I've got my routine. I'm going to feel like this and feel like this. And, the reality of that is not so assured.
But it's not always such a buzzkill. I feel like you don't have to be like, I'm not like that. What, you fool, goodbye. Like, that fantasy is dead in the water, and I must go back to my, what you're fantasizing does reflect something of what you want for yourself. I think it's just a matter of like, how black and white are you making it? You know what I mean? And so in these fantasies of what we want to be, and in the rejection of what is, we tend to polarize. We tend to exaggerate. Instead, it might be like, you might get some routine in, but maybe not. And you might feel better, but just maybe not to the degree that you're imagining at the moment, at least not right now.
Well, there's a beautiful kitchen as well. So I've caught myself going to like I'm going to come like this with cooking and this. I'm like, no, you're not, Sarah. You've been telling yourself this for like, when I was living in house shares up until about 10 years ago, I told myself that the only reason I didn't cook was because I was in house shares and there wasn't enough space to cook. And I really believed that. And then when I got my own place and I didn't cook, I was shook, Stef. I was shook. I was like, oh, it wasn't this. I just genuinely don't particularly like cooking.
So what's the distance then between like evolving and changing and making something happen for yourself and self-delusion,
Yeah. And I think it's coming back to being honest with myself about whether I enjoy certain activities or not. Take gardening, for example. I want to be the kind of person who likes gardening. I really am not that kind of person.
Same.
I'm just not. I don't enjoy it at all. I maybe like the result of it a little bit, the idea of growing your own herbs and vegetables and stuff like that. That's really appealing to me. All of the process, every single part of the process, Stef, is completely unappealing to me. In there, I have to be honest and go, that's never going to happen. With the cooking, I think maybe there's room to play around a bit and see how I feel and decide whether I can make it a bit more fun. Or not.
That sounds really promising. You're like looking around like for an out.
I'd like to bake. I'd like to be someone who bakes. And I don't
good.
bake.
You can live with me because I hate baking.
I don't really like baking either, but again, it's another thing I'd like to like.
You'd like to like it. See? Yeah.
But yeah. Anywho.
Anyhowsies.
Let's not deceive ourselves into thinking we've got more time than we have. Are you reading the Google definition of self-deception?
I'm reading all the different stuff.
Bit late now. We're nearly at the end of the episode.
No, not the definition. The question is posed: what are we hiding from ourselves, and what truths are we running from? And I think that those are important questions to ask. It is offered too that there's 5 signs of self-deception. 1 is that we keep making excuses for ourselves or others. 2, that we can't accept responsibility for things. 3, we keep blaming others. This is a big one. Blaming other people or things in the environment or circumstance. I do that, and then I'm like, I'm doing that, and then I'm like, oh, this is a me problem, not an environment problem, because I'm so self-aware. Keep avoiding unpleasant realities and feel defensive or threatened when people challenge us.
But anyone who's self-deceiving is just going to look at that list and go, that's not me. There needs a certain level of self-awareness to go through those 5 points.
I don't know. I think that there's people who then if that's the case, that person's not listening to this episode because has no interest in it because it doesn't apply to them. But for anyone who has a hunch that this might be something active in their process, I could see people saying like, yeah, I do have a problem accepting responsibility, and I tend to blame other people for things. I think that sometimes you can see that in yourself. And anyone who's ready to evolve around this concept, I think, would have some level of self-awareness around that.
Yeah. So we'll leave you with those questions, listener. Dear listener.
What else?
I think we need to call it, don't we?
All right. Well, on that note,
stay aware. Stay safe. Stay listening and reviewing.
Yes.
Rating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. This was a hard episode for me to put out there. I'm going to say that.
Hard episode. Is that?
Yeah. I just feel I feel really annoying, but
yeah, everyone's going to go, oh, I feel like that sometimes because there's certain things we're talking about occasionally, and like your experience is very different from mine, and my experience in a certain area might be a bit easier than what you've experienced. I'm like, gosh, I just sound like a knob.
Yeah, I hate
going like, oh, I just do this.
You know what? Can we name it? I feel like there's some kind of awareness. Like there's times where I edit episodes and I'm like, sometimes I cut things I say because I cannot stand hearing myself talk that much for that long. It's kind of like they've heard me say enough things. I need to not say anymore. So
this isn't a very long episode, so you can't do that with this.
I'm not going to be cutting. I just want you to know that like some things that might annoy you as a listener annoy me too.
Okay. Again, Steph's just given us more and more examples of how self-aware she is.
You see, it's a defense. It's a defense. See, that's exactly right. Do you understand why I'm doing it? Because I feel like I'm going to offend. I'm going to be annoying, and I don't want to be annoying. So I need to clarify that I know. Yeah.
And she understands that it might be annoying that she's clarifying as well. There's an extra level there, I'm sure. Anyway.
Goodbye. Let's go.
Yeah, goodbye. Let's just get out of here. Bye, listener.